It started as a regular flight. The airport was busy, with people rushing around, pulling their suitcases, and talking on their phones. Inside the plane, things were calmer. Passengers were finding their seats, placing bags in the overhead bins, and settling in for the journey ahead. James was one of those passengers. He was a quiet man, always polite and respectful. He had just finished a long business trip and was tired, looking forward to getting home. He found his seat, put his small bag under the seat in front of him, and sat down with a sigh of relief. The soft hum of the airplane engines and the chatter of people filled the cabin. It seemed like just another normal flight. But little did James know, something very unexpected was about to happen. As he sat in his seat, adjusting his seatbelt and taking out a book to read, a flight attendant walked toward him. She had a sharp, serious look on her face. Her uniform was neat, and she moved quickly down the aisle, checking on passengers. When she reached James, she stopped and looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Sir, this isn't your seat," she said. Her voice was not friendly. It was firm and cold. Some passengers nearby turned their heads, sensing something unusual. James blinked in surprise. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. He looked at it carefully, his eyes moving to the seat number printed on it. Yes, this was his seat. He was sure of it. "I think this is my seat," James said politely, showing his ticket to the flight attendant. But the woman barely looked at it. She crossed her arms and frowned. "No, sir. You need to move," she said, her voice louder this time. James felt confused. He had flown many times before and never had a problem like this. He looked at the ticket again, then at the seat number above him. Everything matched. Why was she asking him to move? "I'm sorry, but my ticket says this is my seat," he repeated, trying to stay calm. The flight attendant let out a small sigh and shook her head. She leaned in closer, her voice turning sharper. "Sir, I'm telling you to move. Please don't make this difficult." James could feel his heart beating faster. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he also knew he was right. Passengers around him started whispering, watching closely. Some of them looked curious, while others looked uncomfortable. No one wanted to be in an argument right before a flight. An older woman sitting across the aisle leaned over and whispered, "Excuse me, young man. Is everything all right?" James gave her a small smile and nodded, but inside, he felt uneasy. He didn't understand why the flight attendant was acting this way. Was it a mistake? Or was there something else going on? The flight attendant's face grew red. She tapped her fingers against her notepad, clearly impatient. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time. You need to move," she said sternly. James looked at her, feeling a mixture of confusion and frustration. He had been nothing but polite, yet she was treating him like he had done something wrong. He glanced around, hoping someone might step in and help, but everyone was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. A man sitting nearby whispered to his friend, "This is getting interesting. I wonder what's going to happen." His friend nodded, eyes wide with curiosity. James decided to stay calm. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but could we check the passenger list? I don't want to take someone else's seat, but I also don't think I'm in the wrong one." The flight attendant let out an annoyed sigh. "Sir, I don't have time for this," she snapped. "You need to listen to me." James felt a wave of frustration but took a deep breath. "I just want to make sure," he said softly. The woman's voice grew even louder. "Sir, if you don't move now, I will have to call security." Passengers gasped quietly. No one expected things to get this serious over a simple seat. A young boy sitting a few rows ahead whispered to his mother, "Mom, why is she being so mean to him?" His mother hushed him, but her eyes were filled with concern. James felt his hands tighten on his ticket. He didn't want to argue, but he also didn't want to be pushed around unfairly. He was sure he was in the right seat. What was going on? A businessman sitting across the aisle finally spoke up. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I saw him check his ticket earlier. He's in the right seat." The flight attendant turned to him, looking even more frustrated. "Sir, this does not concern you," she snapped. James looked at the businessman with a grateful smile. At least someone was on his side. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. People were staring openly now, waiting to see what would happen. James felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't like being the center of attention, but he knew he had to stand up for himself. Taking a deep breath, he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I really think there's a mistake here. Can we please double-check?" Before the flight attendant could answer, another flight crew member, a younger man with a kind face, approached them. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between James and the flight attendant. James held out his ticket. "I believe I'm in the right seat," he explained. The younger flight attendant glanced at the ticket, then at the seat number. He nodded slowly and turned to his colleague. "He's correct," he said gently. "This is his seat." James felt a wave of relief, but the female flight attendant's face turned red with anger. She mumbled something under her breath, turned sharply, and walked away without another word. Passengers sighed in relief. Some even gave James small nods of encouragement. The businessman smiled and said, "Good for you, standing your ground." James nodded back, feeling a mix of emotions. He was glad it was over, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of being treated unfairly. Why had the flight attendant been so quick to assume he was wrong? As he settled back into his seat, he noticed a few people still whispering about what had happened. The older woman across the aisle gave him a kind smile. "You handled that well, young man," she said warmly. James smiled back, but inside, he still felt a little shaken. The flight hadn't even started yet, and already, it had been anything but normal. And just like that, what seemed like an ordinary flight had turned into something far more interesting. But James couldn't help but wonder, was this over? Or was there more trouble ahead? He had a feeling this flight was going to be one to remember. James looked down at his boarding pass again. The seat number printed on the paper matched the number above his seat. He was sure of it. Staying calm, he held up his ticket and said politely, "Ma'am, this is my seat. It matches my ticket." The flight attendant, however, didn't seem to care. She didn't even look at the ticket in his hand. Instead, she crossed her arms, and her face turned serious. Her voice became louder, sharp like a knife cutting through the air. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to move now," she said, her voice filled with anger. The passengers around them turned their heads. Some people leaned forward in their seats, curious to see what was happening. Others whispered quietly to each other. The sound of quiet chatter spread through the cabin like ripples in water. James stayed in his seat. His heart beat a little faster, but he took a deep breath. He didn't want to argue. He wasn't the kind of person who liked fights. But he also knew he was not wrong. He had followed the rules. He had checked his ticket. He was polite. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed. She took a step closer, towering over James. "Sir, you are delaying the flight," she said in a strict tone. "Other passengers are waiting." James nodded calmly. "I understand, ma'am. But I believe there's a mistake. This is my seat. Can we check the list?" The flight attendant huffed and rolled her eyes. She didn't want to listen. She pointed to another empty seat a few rows back. "Just sit there," she said, as if it was no big deal. James shook his head slowly. "I paid for this seat," he replied. "I would like to stay here." People in the seats nearby exchanged glances. A man in a business suit whispered, "This doesn't look good." A mother with two small kids pulled them closer, trying to keep them calm. A young girl sitting near the window whispered to her dad, "Why is she yelling at him?" The air in the cabin felt heavy. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant's face turned red with frustration. She put her hands on her hips and said in a louder voice, "Sir, if you do not move, I will have to call security." James felt a lump in his throat. Security? Over a seat? This was getting serious. He looked around, hoping someone would say something, but most people avoided his eyes. They didn't want to get involved. They just wanted the flight to take off. A woman sitting across the aisle finally spoke up. "Excuse me, I think he's in the right seat. I saw him check his ticket earlier." The flight attendant gave the woman a hard look. "Ma'am, please stay out of this," she said quickly. James sighed. "Please, can we just check?" he asked again, his voice steady but firm. The flight attendant was losing patience. She pulled out a small tablet from her pocket and tapped on it quickly. She looked at the screen, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. James watched her closely. Did she see the truth now? But instead of apologizing, the flight attendant shook her head. "There must be an error in the system," she muttered, refusing to admit she might have made a mistake. "I'm asking you one last time, move to another seat." James sat still. He could feel his hands gripping his ticket tightly. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, but he also knew standing up for himself was important. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. "Why doesn't she just check again?" someone muttered. "He's being so polite," another person whispered. Then, an elderly man sitting nearby spoke up. His voice was calm but strong. "Young man," he said to James, "you've been very patient. If you are in the right seat, you should not have to move." James gave the older man a small smile. He appreciated the support, but the flight attendant looked angrier than before. She turned sharply and walked to the front of the plane. Passengers watched as she spoke with another crew member. They both glanced back at James. He could feel their eyes on him. His stomach felt tight. He didn't like this kind of attention, but he knew he wasn't wrong. A few minutes later, the flight attendant came back. This time, she looked more serious than before. "Sir, if you don't move now, we will delay the flight, and it will be your fault," she said, pointing her finger at James. James felt his face grow warm. He didn't like being blamed. He looked around, hoping someone would say something again. Just then, another flight crew member, a younger man with kind eyes, walked up to them. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from the flight attendant to James. James held up his ticket again. "I believe I'm in the right seat, sir," he explained. The younger flight attendant glanced at the ticket and nodded. "Yes, he's correct," he said simply. A wave of relief washed over James. Finally, someone had checked properly. The older flight attendant's face turned red. She looked embarrassed but didn't apologize. Instead, she said, "Fine. Stay here," and walked away quickly. Passengers sighed in relief. Some even clapped softly. A few people smiled at James and gave him nods of encouragement. James felt better but also a little hurt. Why had she treated him that way? He had been polite the whole time. He had done nothing wrong. Yet she had made him feel like a problem. As he adjusted in his seat, he heard a voice behind him say, "I've seen things like this happen before." Another person added, "Some people just think they can push others around." James didn't reply. He just sat quietly and took a deep breath. He wanted to forget about the whole thing and enjoy the flight. The older woman across the aisle gave him a kind smile. "You did the right thing," she said. James smiled back, thankful for her support. The plane was now ready to take off. The flight attendant who had caused the problem avoided looking at James for the rest of the flight. James leaned back in his seat, knowing he had stood up for himself the right way. And just like that, what had started as a normal flight turned into something James would never forget. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing by staying calm and not giving in to unfair treatment. James sat still, holding his boarding pass tightly in his hands. He knew he was in the right seat. He had checked his ticket carefully before sitting down. But the flight attendant wasn't listening. Her voice was getting louder, and more passengers started to notice what was going on. A man sitting a few rows behind leaned forward and said, "Wait a minute. I saw him check his ticket earlier. That is his seat." James felt a little relief. At least someone had seen the truth. He looked over at the man and gave a small nod of thanks. But the flight attendant ignored him. She didn't even turn to look at the man who spoke up. Instead, she crossed her arms and frowned. "Sir," she said in a stern voice, "you are being disruptive. You need to move now." James blinked in surprise. Disruptive? All he had done was sit in his assigned seat and ask to check his ticket. He couldn't believe what she was saying. Some passengers gasped. Others started whispering to each other. "He's not doing anything wrong," someone murmured. "Why is she being so mean?" James took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he also knew it wasn't fair. He looked straight into the flight attendant's eyes. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he just sat there, calm and firm. Then, something unexpected happened. A woman sitting across the aisle reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen and pointed the camera at James and the flight attendant. The soft click of the phone's recording button could be heard. She was recording everything. Other passengers noticed what she was doing and nodded quietly. Some even pulled out their own phones. The flight attendant glanced at the phone and her face twitched slightly, but she didn't stop. Instead, she spoke even louder. "Sir, I'm warning you. If you don't move, I will have to call security," she said, her voice sharp and cold. The woman with the phone frowned. "We are all watching," she said firmly. "I think you should check his ticket properly." More murmurs spread through the cabin. People were getting uncomfortable. Some were angry. James could feel the energy in the air shift. The passengers didn't like what was happening, and they weren't afraid to show it. James sat quietly. He could feel his heart pounding, but he stayed calm. He wasn't going to let this woman push him around. He knew he had done nothing wrong. Then, a man sitting in the row behind whispered something that made everyone freeze. "She's been like this before," to someone else. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Passengers looked at each other with wide eyes. "Really?" someone whispered. "Who?" another asked. The man nodded slowly. "I was on a flight with her last month," he said in a low voice. "Same thing happened. She picked on another passenger who did nothing wrong. It was awful." A ripple of unease spread across the cabin. People were no longer just curious, they were concerned. Whispers traveled from row to row. "Maybe she's done this before," someone said. "What's her problem?" another asked. James heard it all, but he stayed focused. He knew he wasn't alone now. People believed him. They saw what was happening. The flight attendant's face turned red. She noticed that more people were watching, and she didn't like it. She tapped her foot nervously, glancing at the phone cameras pointed at her. Another voice spoke up, this time from an older woman sitting in the front. "Excuse me, young lady," she said, her voice kind but firm. "This gentleman seems to be right. Perhaps you should check your list again." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. She was clearly not happy. But before she could say anything else, another flight attendant appeared. This one was younger, with a friendly face and a calm voice. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking around. James held up his ticket. "I believe I'm in the right seat," he said simply. His voice was steady and polite, but everyone could hear the frustration behind it. The younger flight attendant took the ticket and looked at it closely. He checked the seat number and the passenger list. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes, you're in the right seat," he said, looking at James with a reassuring smile. A few passengers clapped softly, showing their support. James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had been right all along. The first flight attendant's face turned red again. She looked embarrassed but said nothing. Without another word, she turned around and walked toward the front of the plane, avoiding eye contact with everyone. James sighed in relief. He leaned back in his seat, feeling exhausted but relieved that he had stood his ground. The woman with the phone smiled at him. "Good for you," she said. "You handled that well." James smiled back. "Thank you," he said quietly. The older man behind him patted his shoulder. "It's important to stand up for yourself," he said with a nod. "People need to see the truth." As the plane prepared for takeoff, James looked around at the other passengers. Some gave him encouraging smiles, while others whispered among themselves. He realized something important: when people see something wrong, they should speak up. And today, people had spoken up for him. He turned to the window and watched as the plane taxied down the runway. Despite the rocky start, he knew he had done the right thing by not moving from his rightful seat. And as the plane lifted into the sky, James thought to himself, sometimes, you just have to stay strong and believe in yourself. The air inside the plane felt heavy. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. James sat quietly in his seat, his hands resting on his lap, but his heart was beating fast. The flight attendant stood in front of him, arms crossed, looking angry. The passengers were whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The woman with the phone was still recording, her eyes focused on every word and movement. Just when it felt like things couldn't get any worse, the door to the cockpit opened with a soft click. Out stepped the captain. He was tall, with silver hair and a serious face. His uniform was neat, and he walked with confidence. The moment he appeared, the noise in the cabin stopped. It was like someone had pressed a pause button. Everyone looked at him, their eyes wide with curiosity and hope. The captain glanced around the cabin, his calm eyes moving from one passenger to another before resting on the flight attendant. His voice was deep but kind as he asked, "What seems to be the problem here?" James looked up, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. He hoped the captain would listen and understand. The flight attendant quickly spoke up before James could say anything. Her voice was sharp. "This passenger refuses to move to another seat, and he is being uncooperative," she said, pointing at James. James opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, several passengers started talking at once. "That's not true," said the man sitting behind James. "I saw him check his ticket, he's in the right seat," added another passenger. "She's the one being rude," the woman with the phone said firmly. The captain raised his hand, and everyone fell silent. He looked at James. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" he asked politely. James quickly handed it over, his fingers slightly trembling. He wanted to stay calm, but the situation was stressful. The captain studied the ticket carefully, looking at the seat number, then glanced up at the overhead seat marker. After a few moments, he nodded and handed the ticket back to James. "Thank you, sir," he said with a small smile. Then, he turned to the flight attendant, his face becoming serious. The woman with the phone tapped her screen and held it up. "Captain, you might want to see this," she said. The captain leaned in and watched the video. The entire cabin was silent as they all waited for his reaction. In the video, the flight attendant could be heard raising her voice at James, refusing to check his ticket, and telling him he was being disruptive. The captain's face grew stern. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes darkened. He straightened up, turned to the flight attendant, and said, "Step into my office, please." His voice was firm, not loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. The flight attendant hesitated, looking around as if searching for support. No one spoke up for her. The other crew members avoided her gaze. Finally, she sighed and walked toward the galley at the front of the plane. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the passengers started whispering again. "I knew she was wrong," said a young woman sitting near the window. "The captain will handle it," whispered an older man, nodding to himself. "I'm glad someone stood up for him," another voice added. James sat quietly, feeling a bit overwhelmed. He hadn't expected this much attention. All he wanted was to sit in his seat and have a peaceful flight. A few moments passed, and then a voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The flight will continue shortly." Passengers exchanged curious looks. What did that mean? What was happening with the flight attendant? James looked toward the front, but the curtain remained closed. He couldn't see what was happening behind it. Then, one of the other flight attendants walked down the aisle, stopping beside James. She smiled kindly. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened," she said softly. "You were right all along. The captain has taken care of it." James nodded, grateful for her words. "Thank you," he said quietly. The woman with the phone leaned over and patted his shoulder. "You handled it well," she said. "I'm glad you didn't move." James smiled but still felt a little uneasy. It had been a stressful situation, but at least now it was over. After a while, the plane finally began to taxi down the runway. Passengers settled back into their seats, and the usual flight announcements played over the speakers. But one thing was different: the flight attendant who had caused all the trouble did not return. A different crew member took over, walking up and down the aisle with a friendly smile, helping passengers and checking seat belts. Passengers whispered to each other. "Do you think she got fired?" someone asked. "Maybe she was sent off the plane," another person guessed. James didn't say anything. He just sat quietly, looking out the window as the plane lifted off into the sky. As the plane climbed higher, the same kind flight attendant returned and offered him a drink. She leaned down and whispered, "The captain wanted me to let you know that if you need anything, just ask." James smiled and nodded. "Thanks," he said, feeling relieved. Looking around, he noticed that many passengers were now smiling at him, some giving him thumbs up or small nods. It felt nice to have their support. As the flight went on, James thought about what had happened. He had stood up for himself, stayed calm, and in the end, the truth had come out. He realized that sometimes, you just have to believe in yourself, even when others don't. A few hours later, when the plane landed, James gathered his things and stood up to leave. As he walked down the aisle, a few passengers gave him encouraging smiles. The woman with the phone waved and said, "Take care." James smiled back. "You too," he said. Stepping off the plane, he took a deep breath of fresh air. He was glad it was over. And as he walked through the airport, he couldn't help but feel proud of himself for standing his ground. Sometimes, he thought, the quietest voice in the room can make the biggest difference. The whispers in the airplane slowly turned into excited chatter. Passengers were looking at each other with wide eyes, nodding, and talking in hushed voices. The news had spread quickly: something big had just happened. A few moments ago, the flight attendant who had been causing trouble walked to the front of the plane and never came back. People began to wonder where she had gone and what was going on behind the curtain. Then, a calm and friendly crew member walked down the aisle with a small smile. She stopped beside James and leaned in to speak quietly. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to let you know, the flight attendant has been removed from the flight. She will not be returning." James looked up in surprise. He blinked a few times, processing what he had just heard. "She's gone?" he asked. The crew member nodded. "Yes. The captain decided it was best for everyone." For a moment, James didn't say anything. He just sat there, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. Then, from somewhere in the back of the plane, a slow clap began. Clap, clap, clap. More people joined in, and soon the entire cabin was filled with applause. People were smiling and nodding at James, showing their support. Some even cheered softly. "Good job, man!" someone called out. "You stood your ground," another passenger said. James felt a warm wave of gratitude wash over him. He gave a small, polite nod to the passengers who were clapping for him. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but in this moment, he felt proud of himself for staying calm and doing the right thing. As the applause died down, the captain himself walked down the aisle. He was tall and confident, his uniform crisp, and his eyes serious but kind. When he reached James' seat, he extended his hand. James shook it firmly. The captain looked James in the eye and said, "I want to personally apologize for what you went through." His voice was strong, but James could hear the kindness and regret in it. James appreciated his words but didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." The captain sighed and continued, "What happened to you was not acceptable, and it's being handled. We take these matters very seriously." James nodded again, feeling reassured. He could see that the captain meant what he said. Passengers nearby were listening closely. They looked pleased to hear that the airline was taking action. One older lady leaned over and whispered, "Good. That kind of behavior should never be allowed." James agreed silently. No one should have to go through something like this, especially when they had done nothing wrong. The crew member who had spoken to him earlier returned with a bottle of water and a small snack. "Here you go, sir," she said kindly. "Please let us know if you need anything else." James smiled. "Thank you," he said softly. He wasn't thirsty, but the kind gesture made him feel better. As the plane continued its journey, James finally relaxed in his seat. He glanced around the cabin, noticing how much calmer things felt now. Passengers were back to reading, watching movies, or chatting quietly. The tension that had filled the air earlier was gone. He took a deep breath and thought about everything that had happened. He had felt so small and powerless when the flight attendant first confronted him. But he had stayed calm, spoken up for himself, and in the end, justice had been served. The woman with the phone leaned over from across the aisle. "You did the right thing," she said with a kind smile. "I'm glad I recorded it." James smiled back. "I appreciate that," he said. "I just didn't want to be treated unfairly." She nodded. "No one does. But not everyone stands up for themselves like you did." James thought about that for a moment. He had never been the kind of person to make a scene or draw attention to himself. But today, he realized how important it was to stand up when something wasn't right. A few rows back, a young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, why did everyone clap for him?" His mother smiled and said, "Because he stood up for himself, sweetheart. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing you can do." James overheard the conversation and felt a sense of pride. He hoped the boy would remember this moment and learn something valuable from it. As the plane flew high above the clouds, James closed his eyes for a moment. He felt peaceful now. The stressful situation was over, and justice had been served. Later, when the plane began its descent, another flight attendant, one James hadn't seen before, approached him. She smiled warmly and said, "The captain asked me to let you know that he has reported the incident to the airline. They will review everything once we land." James nodded. "I appreciate that," he said. As the plane touched down, James felt grateful that the situation had been handled properly. When it was time to leave, passengers smiled at him as they walked past. Some patted him on the back, while others whispered words of support. At the door, the captain stood waiting. He shook James' hand again and said, "Thank you for your patience today. I hope you have a great rest of your trip." James smiled. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate everything." As he stepped off the plane and walked into the airport, James took a deep breath. He felt lighter, knowing he had stood his ground and that fairness had won. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he thought about the lesson he had learned today. Sometimes, being calm and standing up for what's right can make all the difference. And sometimes, the quietest voice can be the strongest one of all.